Portsmouth, Ohio, 2010. A town on the Ohio River that once made half the shoes in America. The factories are gone. Main Street is boarded up. And where the community swimming pool used to sit, a pool the size of a football field, the beating heart of this town for 50 years, a place everyone here just called Dreamland. There is now a strip mall and a parking lot. In that parking lot, a kid from a good family climbs into an old Nissan to meet a driver with a mouth full of balloons. Each balloon holds a single dose of the cheapest, crudest heroin ever sold in the United States, and it got delivered to him like a pizza. 30 years earlier, nobody in this town had ever seen heroin. Not once. Today, drugs like the one in those balloons are the leading killer of Americans under the age of 45. This is where it begins. To understand how a sticky black lump of drug delivered out of a Nissan in Ohio killed more Americans than the Vietnam War, you have to go back, way back, to a single flower. Papaver somniferum, the opium poppy. A pale, papery bloom, pink or purple or white, with a fat green seed pod at its center. Scratch that pod with a blade, and it weeps a milky sap that turns brown and gummy in the air. That sap is where all of this comes from. Every painkiller in your medicine cabinet, every overdose in every American town, all of it traces back to the bleeding of that one pod. People figured this out a staggeringly long time ago. You've probably heard that the ancient Sumerians called the poppy the joy plant around 3400 BC. Set that aside. That's a shaky guess from the 1920s that later scholars quietly walked back. The real, physical evidence is older and stranger. In a cave near Granada, in what is now Spain, archaeologists found opium poppy seed pods tucked inside woven grass bags, carbon dated to somewhere between 5,600 and 4,000 BC. Sit with that number. Human beings were harvesting this flower more than 7,000 years before there was a United States of America. Before the pyramids, before writing, in most of the world. This flower has been in the human bloodstream longer than almost anything we grow. For thousands of years, that gummy brown sap, raw opium, was the whole story. You smoked it, you drank it, you chewed it. It killed pain, it killed grief, and it killed people, quietly, for millennia. Then chemistry showed up and made it worse. In the early 1800s, a young German pharmacist named Friedrich Sertürner isolated the single most powerful compound hiding inside that poppy sap. He named it after Morpheus, the Greek god of dreams. He called it morphine. It was the first time in history anyone had pulled a pure drug out of a plant, and it was 10 times stronger than the raw opium it came from. Decades later, chemists took morphine and pushed it one step further, cooking it into an even more potent cousin. That cousin is heroin, and here is the part that matters for our story. There are two ways to make that final product. One is the clean, patient, pharmaceutical way, the way that produces a fine white powder in a laboratory. The other is the fast, cheap, brutal way. Boil it down in the back of a mountain shack, skip the final purification, and you're left with something dark, sticky, and crude. Dark brown to black, the texture of roofing tar or hardened molasses. That crude version has a street name that describes it perfectly: black tar. The white powder heroin most Americans pictured for a century came out of Asia and later, Colombia. But black tar has a very specific birthplace, and it isn't a lab. It's a mountain range. Run your finger down the Pacific side of Mexico and you'll hit the Sierra Madre Occidental, a spine of steep, remote, fog-wrapped mountains stretching farther than the drive from New York City to Chicago. Cool nights, volcanic soil, hidden valleys a helicopter can barely reach. It is, as it turns out, a nearly perfect place to grow opium poppies. The poppy didn't sprout there on its own. The best evidence says Chinese migrants brought poppy cultivation to Mexico's western states, especially Sinaloa, in the late 1800s and early 1900s, as they moved through the region working mines and railroads. The seeds took to those mountains like they'd been waiting for them. And through the 20th century, as American appetite for opium products grew and then got driven underground by Prohibition-era drug laws, those mountain farmers found a buyer to the north that never, ever stopped buying the United States. Picture one of those farmers, up before dawn, moving through rows of poppies with a small curved blade. He scores each swollen pod with a few shallow cuts and moves on. By the time the sun is up, each cut is beaded with sticky brown sap. He comes back and scrapes it off by hand. It smells sharp and green and bitter. His fingers go black. That raw scraping is the beginning of a supply chain that will end eventually in a suburban American bathroom 900 miles away. What made black tar special wasn't quality, it was the opposite. It was crude, impure, unpolished. And that was the whole point. It was cheap to make. It didn't require a chemist or a real lab. A poor farming family could produce it. And because it was so cheap to produce, it could be sold cheap. Cheaper than the powder heroin the East Coast had known for decades. Cheap enough to undercut everyone. For most of the 20th century, that crude Mexican tar stayed a regional product. It served the old established heroin markets of the American West, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and not much else. A cheap, dirty drug for a small, shrinking population of hardcore users. Nobody in Middle America was worried about it. Nobody in Portsmouth, Ohio had ever heard the words black tar. That was about to change, because a group of young men from one small town in Mexico were about to do something nobody in the drug world had ever done. They were going to take the crudest heroin on the market and sell it like a Fortune 500 company. Before we go further, if you're new here, this channel covers the hidden histories behind the things that shaped the world. Real stories, real numbers, no filler. New video every week. Hit subscribe so you don't miss it. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, whether you're in Texas, New York, or somewhere in between. I always want to know. There's a small town in the Mexican state of Nayarit called Xalisco. Not Jalisco, the big state. Xalisco, a farm town most Americans will never hear of, in a state roughly the size of Massachusetts. Sugarcane country. And out of that one town came a network so clever that law enforcement had genuinely never seen anything like it. Everyone in America has a mental picture of a drug cartel. Guns, gold, violence, territory soaked in blood. The men from Xalisco looked at that model and did the exact opposite of all of it. They didn't build a cartel. They built franchises, small, independent cells, each one run like a little family business, each operating in a different American city, mostly never touching each other. Law enforcement spent years unable to even understand what they were looking at, because there was no kingpin, no fortress, no army, just a quiet, distributed web of ordinary-looking guys in ordinary-looking cars. And the way they sold was pure customer service. This is the detail that stops people cold. A user didn't go to a dangerous corner in a bad part of town. He called a phone number, like ordering a pizza. A dispatcher took the order, and a driver, a young man from Xalisco on a salary, drove out to meet him in a normal car in a normal parking lot. A McDonald's lot, a Walmart lot, broad daylight. The driver carried the tar in tiny balloons held loose in his mouth so that if the police pulled him over, he could swallow the evidence before they got to the window. The drivers were paid a flat salary. Think about how smart that is. A salaried driver has no reason to cut the product or shortchange the customer because he doesn't earn more by doing it. So the tar stayed potent and the service stayed friendly. If a customer complained the last balloon was weak, they'd make it right. Some cells ran specials, discounts for volume, free samples to people just getting out of detox, because a person just out of detox has no tolerance and is terrified and is the most loyal customer you will ever have. One reporter, who spent years documenting all of this, Sam Quinones, laid it out in his book Dreamland, and his conclusion was almost unbelievable. These guys had a customer service ethic you'd expect from Apple or Trader Joe's. They avoided guns because violence brings cops. They kept only small amounts on hand because big busts bring headlines. They were, in the most horrifying way possible, model small businessmen, and they had a genius instinct for territory. They stayed out of the big coastal cities where the established cartels and the powder heroin gangs already ruled, and where a turf war would get them killed. Instead, they drove into the places heroin had never been. Mid-sized, working-class, mostly white American cities. Denver, Salt Lake, Columbus, Charlotte, Nashville. Places where the police weren't looking for heroin because heroin had never been there. For a long time, one hard line held. Black tar was a Western drug. There's an invisible border that runs down the middle of this country, the Mississippi River, and for decades it split the American heroin map in two. Black tar to the west of it, powder to the east. The DEA still tracks it that way today. Tar in the west, powder on the east coast. Then, according to Quinones, one Xalisco trafficker, a man remembered only as the Man, crossed it. He set up a cell in Columbus, Ohio, and brought black tar heroin east of the Mississippi for the first time in history. That crossing is the moment the fuse reached the powder keg, because waiting for him on the other side of that river was something the Xalisco boys could never have manufactured on their own. A ready-made army of addicts, hundreds of thousands of them, ordinary Americans, and they'd been created with a prescription pad by a company headquartered in Connecticut. Here's what nobody tells you about the heroin epidemic. Heroin didn't start it. A pill did. In 1996, an American pharmaceutical company called Purdue Pharma, owned by a family named Sackler, launched a new painkiller called OxyContin. It was a high-dose opioid, chemically a close cousin of the very drug in those Mexican balloons, wrapped in a time-release coating that was supposed to let it out slowly over 12 hours. Purdue marketed it like nothing the pharmaceutical world had seen. An army of sales reps fanned out across America, and they pushed a single comforting message to doctors: this is safe. The risk of addiction, they claimed, was less than 1%. Where did that number come from? This is the part that should make you lean in. It came, in large part, from a single paragraph. In 1980, two researchers named Porter and Jick sent a short letter, 5 sentences, to the New England Journal of Medicine, noting that among hospitalized patients given opioids under close supervision, addiction was rare. It was a letter to the editor. It was not a study. It said nothing about handing bottles of high-dose pills to people to take home for months. That one paragraph got cited over the following decades, hundreds of times, as if it were hard proof that opioids were safe. A 5-sentence letter about hospital patients became the scientific foundation for flooding America with take-home narcotics. The pills poured into exactly the kind of towns the Xalisco boys would later target, places like Portsmouth, Ohio, where the factories had closed and the jobs had left, and the pain, physical and otherwise, was everywhere. Doctors opened clinics that were pill mills in everything but name. People waited in the parking lot in their pajamas. In some towns, an 80-milligram pill became a literal currency. You could buy a stolen power saw, or a car part, or groceries with pills. An entire shadow economy running on a prescription drug, with the local Walmart as the supply closet for the shoplifters who fed it. At the peak of this, in 2012, American doctors wrote roughly 255 million opioid prescriptions in a single year. That is nearly enough for a bottle for every adult in the country. Quick question, and I want you to actually answer it in your head. How far do you think you live right now from the nearest person in active opioid addiction? A mile? 10? Drop your honest guess in the comments. I'll tell you the real number before this is over, and it's going to bother you. Now here's how the pill and the tar found each other. Millions of Americans got hooked on the pills first. Then two things happened at once. Doctors and the DEA started cracking down on the pill mills, and in 2010, Purdue reformulated OxyContin so it was harder to crush and abuse. Suddenly the pills got scarce and expensive, but the addiction didn't go away. Addiction doesn't care about a supply chain. Those millions of people still needed opioids, and now the cheap legal ones were drying up. And there, right on schedule, was a young man from Xalisco in a clean Nissan in the McDonald's parking lot with a mouth full of balloons, offering the same high for a fraction of the price, delivered to your neighborhood. Researchers found that roughly 3 out of every 4 new heroin users in this era had started with prescription pills. The pill built the customer. The tar closed the sale. American doctors, American companies, and American pharmacies were the front end of this machine. The mountains of Mexico were the back end, and the whole thing ran straight through American living rooms. We've been talking about business models and supply chains, so let me stop and tell you what this crude drug actually does to a human body, because the customer service framing hides a slaughter. Black tar is crude on purpose, and that crudeness has a cost the user pays in blood. Because it's dark and sticky, users often heat it and inject it, and the impurities and the injection practices give black tar a signature that powder heroin doesn't carry to the same degree. Horrific bacterial infections, wound botulism, flesh-rotting infections at the injection site. Emergency rooms across the West learned to recognize a specific kind of catastrophic wound that came almost exclusively from tar. And then there's the killing itself. Because it's crude, the potency swings wildly from batch to batch. The user has no way to know if today's balloon is half the strength of yesterday's or double it. Double is a death sentence. The margin between a high and a fatal overdose in a street opioid is razor thin, and with a product mixed in a mountain shack, nobody is measuring. The people dying were not who America expected. For a century, the country's mental image of a heroin user was an inner city stereotype, and that image let middle America look away. But the Xalisco network had deliberately sold into white, working-class, suburban towns. So the people overdosing were high school athletes, nurses, the kids of cops and pastors and doctors, the children of the very town whose swimming pool had been called Dreamland. The shame was so heavy that families put "died suddenly" in the obituaries. A generation was dying, and the epidemic stayed half invisible because everyone was too ashamed to say the word out loud. The Xalisco boys, for their part, mostly didn't think of themselves as killers. Many were poor kids from a farm town who'd found a way to build a house for their parents back home. They weren't the villains of this story, not the real ones. They were the delivery mechanism. The people who built the epidemic, who knew the risk and buried it and kept selling, were wearing suits. Here is the part where I have to be straight with you, because I know how these stories usually go. In a lot of corporate scandals, there's a smoking gun memo, the internal document where an executive does the cold math and writes down, in dollars, that it's cheaper to let people die than to fix the problem. When I researched this, I went looking for that memo for Purdue, that precise document, the one where they price out American lives against profit, isn't sitting there in the record the way people imagine. But you don't need the memo, because the real numbers tell the story just as loudly. Over the years it sold OxyContin, Purdue Pharma and the Sackler family took in enormous sums, by many estimates, revenue north of $30 billion. $30 billion. Now watch what the consequences cost them at first. In 2007, Purdue and 3 executives pleaded guilty in federal court to misleading the public about how addictive OxyContin was. The penalty was about $634 million. That sounds like a lot until you set it against $30 billion. It was a fraction of the profit. Nobody went to prison, and the company kept right on selling the drug. This decision seemed small at the time. It was not. Go back to the very beginning to 1995, to the moment before OxyContin ever hit the market. When the FDA approved the drug, it approved a label, and that label included a line suggesting the time-release design was believed to reduce the drug's potential for abuse. A quiet, technical, administrative sentence in a government-approved document. Purdue's entire It's Safe marketing campaign would lean on the credibility of that line for years. The FDA medical officer who signed off on that approval left the agency not long after. Within a couple of years, he was working for Purdue. That's how it works. It's not a cackling villain in a boardroom. It's a revolving door. It's a regulator's quiet sign-off that becomes a marketing weapon. It's a 5-sentence letter promoted into a law of nature. Each individual step looks small, defensible, bureaucratic. Add them up, and you get 900,000 dead Americans. The FDA's approval opened the door. Purdue's marketing walked the country through it. The pill mills held it open. And when the pills got cut off, the men from Xalisco were waiting on the other side. Every link in that chain had a moment where someone could have said stop. Almost nobody did. For years, the machine protected itself the way these machines always do. Lawyers, lobbyists, settlements, quiet enough to stay out of the headlines. A message pushed relentlessly to doctors and regulators that the real problem was a few bad abusers, not the product and not the people selling it, but it came apart. Journalists and prosecutors kept pulling the thread. Reporters like Sam Quinones connected the pill mills of Appalachia to the balloons of Xalisco and showed America they were one story. A US attorney in Western Virginia, John Brownlee, filed the first big federal case against Purdue. State attorneys general lined up one after another until nearly all of them were suing the same family. And the bill came due, the real bill, the one measured in Americans. Since 1999, the United States has recorded more than 1 million drug overdose deaths. Roughly 900,000 of them involve opioids, the pills, the tar, and what came after. That's more Americans than we lost in every war of the 20th century combined. Overdose became the leading cause of death for adults aged 18 to 44. Not car crashes, not guns, not cancer. Overdose. Nearly 5 million Americans are living with opioid use disorder right now. And even at the peak of the dying, only about 1 in 4 of the people who needed medication to treat it were getting it. So, that question from earlier, about how far you live from someone in active opioid addiction. With nearly 5 million Americans carrying this, in every state, every county, every income bracket, the honest answer for most people watching this is closer than you'd ever want to believe. Possibly your own street, possibly your own house. As for the people who built the front end of this, in November 2025, after the Supreme Court threw out an earlier deal that had tried to shield the family, a federal bankruptcy judge finally approved a settlement. Purdue Pharma is being dissolved and rebuilt as a new company under a non-profit. The Sackler family agreed to pay up to $7 billion over 15 years. Some of it, around $850 million, is set aside for victims and their families, which works out to something like $8,000 to $16,000 for a person whose life was taken apart by this drug. $8,000 against $30 billion in profit. Do that math, and you'll understand everything about how this country prices a human life against a quarterly earnings report. Purdue knew there was a problem in the 1990s. They kept going for years. And Americans paid the price, 900,000 of them, and counting. So where does black tar heroin live in America today? Here's the grim, strange twist. It's dying, and what's replacing it is worse. For decades that Mississippi River line held, and black tar ruled everything west of it, the entire western half of the United States. The DEA's own recent lab reports still confirm it. Tar is the dominant form of heroin west of the Mississippi. It conquered that half of the country and held it for a generation. But a new drug came for the tar the same way the tar came for the pills. Fentanyl, a synthetic opioid so potent that a lethal amount is smaller than what's in a packet of sugar, has swept across the country and largely erased heroin from the street supply. And here's the darkly ironic part. The West, black tar's stronghold, actually got a brief reprieve because federal researchers found fentanyl was harder to mix into sticky black tar than into powder. The crudeness that made tar so deadly for so long is, for one last moment, the thing slowing fentanyl down. That reprieve is ending. Fentanyl is now turning up inside the tar itself. The dying, at last, is slowing. American overdose deaths peaked at around 114,000 in a single year and have since fallen for 3 straight years, down to roughly 70,000 in 2025, the lowest since 2019. That's tens of thousands of Americans still alive who wouldn't be. It is the first real good news in a quarter century. It is also still about 190 dead Americans every single day. And the whole apparatus that fed this thing is still standing, just wearing new clothes. The opioid still lives in your medicine cabinet, in the orange prescription bottle, and now, on the shelf at your CVS and your Walgreens, right out in the open next to the cough drops, there's a new product America has quietly agreed it needs. Narcan, the overdose antidote, over the counter since 2023. We now sell the emergency reversal for this drug in the same aisle as the Tylenol. That's where we are. That's the country this flower built. Slow down with me for a second, because this is the part that matters. Every chapter of this story is the same move, run over and over. A crude drug gets sold to Americans as something safe and modern. Raw opium became refined morphine. Morphine became heroic, non-addictive heroin. A dangerous narcotic became a safe, time-released pill your doctor promised was different. And when that promise finally collapsed, a cheap crude tar from a Mexican farm town was waiting to catch everyone who fell. Different century, different label, same flower, same molecule. The only thing that ever really changed was who got rich and who got the piece of paper that said it was safe. America likes to believe in a few things about itself. Free markets that punish bad products, a government that protects you from poison, transparency, so that you can find out the truth before it kills someone you love. This drug's history is where all three of those beliefs go to die. The market rewarded the poison, the government approved the label, and the truth arrived a decade and 900,000 funerals too late. So let me leave you with a real question, and I don't have an answer for it. How many things in your life right now, a pill, a product, a promise on a label, came with the word safe printed on it by someone who already knew better and cashed the check anyway? And how would you ever find out before it was too late? Let that sit for a second. Then do me a favor. If you've ever lost someone to this, or watched a town, a family, a person you loved get swallowed by it, I want to hear about it. Drop it in the comments. I read every single one, and on this video, those comments matter more than usual. If this is the kind of story you want more of, the real history behind the things that quietly run your life, subscribe, hit the like button. On a video like this one, it genuinely helps it reach the people who need to see it. And share this with someone who thinks they already know how the opioid epidemic happened. Because they think it started with a needle. It started with a flower, a 5-sentence letter, and a signature on a label. It began as sap bled from a poppy on a mountainside 7,000 years ago. It ended up in an orange bottle in your bathroom, on a shelf at your CVS, and in the veins of somebody in your own town you would never suspect. That's not a coincidence, that's the receipt. And the next time you open your medicine cabinet, you'll know exactly what you're looking at, and you'll never be able to unknow it.